Hello students, we are going to continue our chapter 4 lesson 4 notes. This is going to conclude our lesson 4 notes. So we are on the last piece of the information, which is new British policies. And our first question is, how did the French loss affect the Native Americans in the Ohio Valley? Because remember, the French Indian War is over now, and France lost the war, and they had many Native American allies. So we talked about in the treaty how it affected Great Britain and France and Spain, but it doesn't say anything about the Native Americans. So they're kind of an important piece of the puzzle. So we're going to continue reading here under new British policies. Okay. The French defeat was a blow to Native Americans in the Ohio River Valley. They had lost their French allies and trading partners and now had to deal with the British. The British raised their prices of their goods. Unlike the French, the British refused to pay Native Americans to use their land. Worst of all, more colonists began settling in Native American lands. Many Native Americans saw the settlers as a threat to their way of life. One of these was Pontiac, the chief of an Ottawa village near Detroit. In 1763, Pontiac and his forces captured the British fort at Detroit and other British outposts. During Pontiac's war, Native Americans killed settlers along the Pennsylvania and Virginia frontiers. I actually went a little bit farther than I needed to answer this first question. So how did the French loss affect the Native Americans in the Ohio Valley? So it talks about that in a couple different places, that they lost their French allies and their trading partners. They also now had to trade with the British, right? So the British raised the prices of their goods. The British refused to pay Native Americans to use their land. And then, worst of all, the British started settling on Native American lands. I am going to again remind you that NA is for Native Americans. And GB is for Great Britain. Okay. I'll give you a moment to type all of those in. And our next question, what was Pontiac's War? And I got that answer in that next paragraph that I actually continued to read. And here is where it says Pontiac's War is what we're talking about here. And we have the Ottawa chief is Pontiac. And so that's why it's called Pontiac's War. So we're going to put a couple different things here. That Pontiac, the Ottawa chief, captured British forts and outposts, and then Native Americans killed settlers along the Pennsylvania and the Virginia frontier. So remember, PA is Pennsylvania. And VA is Virginia. Okay, and then number 3, what event led to the proclamation of 1763? So I'm going to continue reading here. The same year as Pontiac's War began, Britain's King George declared that colonists were not to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. To enforce the new rule, the British planned to keep 10,000 troops in America. The Proclamation of 1763 helped remove a source of conflict with Native Americans, and it also kept colonists on the coast where the British could control them. So the event that led to the Proclamation of 1763 was Pontiac's War, because it was between Ottawa and Great Britain. And they needed to sort of solve that problem of the Native Americans wanting to continue to attack the British. And so they created the Proclamation of 1763, and that was here in this paragraph here, that colonists were not to settle west of the mountains. So this was the boundary line. The Appalachian Mountains became the boundary line once again, because before the French and Indian War, the Appalachian Mountains was the natural boundary line on the west side. But after the war now, it opened up all of the land to the Mississippi River. But now the king is saying, even though that land belongs to us, we don't want you settling over there because of these Native American problems that we're having because of Pontiac's War. And so they were trying to reduce that conflict between the Native Americans and the British and the settlers, of course, because it's the settlers who are there. And so they said, oh yeah, we have all this new land that you potentially could live on, but we are not allowing it. We created the Proclamation of 1763. And what they also did was, let's see, there we go. They used 10,000 soldiers to enforce the boundary. So the king had 10,000 of his men basically line along the mountains to keep settlers from moving west past those mountains. And they put this into effect on October 7th, 1763. Now, the war had ended in February. So several months have gone by already, and people have already started to move west past the mountains. And now they're being told that they can't. They're kind of taking it back now at this point. So I'm going to give you another moment to make sure that you have this written before I go to the next question. So I'm actually going to leave that there for a moment as I read on, and then I'll turn the page when we're ready to answer the question. The question we're looking for now is, how did the colonists feel about the proclamation, meaning this proclamation of 1763 and them not being able to move west of the mountains? So I will continue reading here in the next paragraph. Colonists believed the proclamation limited their freedom of movement. They feared that large number of British troops might interfere with their liberties. As a result, distrust began to grow between Britain and its American colonies. Britain's financial problems also led to trouble. Deeply in debt as a result of the war with France, the British government made plans to tax the colonies and tighten trade rules. These efforts would lead to conflict and eventually revolution. That's what we're leading up to here. So I'm going to turn here to the next part. And how did they feel about the proclamation? Well, it basically says it right here in that first sentence. Second sentence, actually, both of them. So it limited their freedom of movement, right? You are telling us now we can't move to this land that is part of our country. And they're upset about that. And so many of them did move west anyways. Remember, some of them already moved west before this, but some of them still continued to move west. And this will be one of the many conflicts between the British and the colonists that are going to lead to the Revolutionary War. So even though they have those 10,000 soldiers that are lined up along the mountains, even if those soldiers stood, arm to arm, their arms stretched out to each other, they would not cover the entire mountain range. So there are going to be gaps. There are going to be places that the colonists are still going to be able to get through. Some of them may be more treacherous than others, but there's still going to be ways that colonists will get around the mountains and to the west if it's something that they really wanted. And they already said that they were going to end up taxing the colonists after the war. And then they already put into place those navigation acts, which said that the colonists could only trade with Great Britain, but they're going to increase some of the laws on trade even further. And so we're going to see that in our next chapter, which is really going to focus on all of the problems between the colonists and Great Britain that will bring them to fighting in a war. Okay, so hopefully you've had enough time to write this answer on here. And that concludes all of the information in our lesson 4 notes.